Alright, so the upcoming topic is a little bit out of the ordinary for my channel, and I want to acknowledge that straight out of the gate to let you know that videos primarily surrounding homesteading, shepherding, food security, those things are the baseline of my channel, and that is not changing. And if I'm completely honest, this particular research project took a turn I didn't expect. I expected to make this video in sort of a finale of my Amish farmer coverage because it was a topic that Robert Barnes mentioned in one of our interviews, and I was going to bring it to you to show you guys that, hey, look, history shows us that for a little while state-sponsored evil wins, but it eventually is brought to justice. However, you're going to see in the upcoming video that this took a turn, and I found out things about Nuremberg that I didn't really expect, but soon realized that the facts I uncovered were probably more relevant to today's world than the message I initially had in mind to share. We're living at a point in time where history is being forgotten or rewritten, leaving us kind of wondering how we got here in the first place. Upcoming is one of those forgotten pieces of history that has a massive amount of relevance to where we're at today. In fact, if you're like me, you're seeing a lot in the headlines about the International Criminal Court, international law, the United Nations, and ironically today is the 79th anniversary of the United Nations as an organization. The Nuremberg Trials gives historical context as to how those organizations initially put down their roots. And we all know the saying, those that fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. So it is in the spirit of those words, and with hopes that this will equip you to better face the future, that I present to you my research on the Nuremberg Trials.
This trial is part of the great effort to make the peace more secure. One step in this direction is the United Nations organization. This charter and this trial constitute another step in the same direction.
This video will contain an overview of the Nuremberg Trials, why I chose to research this topic in the first place, and what I found after traveling to Nuremberg, Germany in person. I'm going to outline how the Nuremberg Trials were used for the early establishment of the United Nations organization, sharing important criticisms from those who saw how the 1945 trials were being exploited, and finally, showing how that same process of exploitation was utilized during the global pandemic of 2020, exemplifying the saying that history never repeats itself, but it often rhymes, and encouraging you towards watchfulness into the future. I set out in my research of Nuremberg after talking with Robert Barnes, lead attorney for the Amos Miller Amish farmer trials. He used Nuremberg as sort of a hyperbolic parallel to that of the Amish farmer, as a positive precedent for the punishment of state-sponsored evil. And that is exactly the angle from which I initially approached my research on the Nuremberg trials. In fact, so excited was I to bring you this story on justice over state-sponsored evil that I traveled to Nuremberg, Germany in person, touring the courthouse and the former Nazi Party rally grounds. Now, the Nuremberg trials took place at the close of World War II, after the blistering defeat of Hitler and his Nazi regime. The trials involved the indictment and execution of high-ranking Nazi officials by the victorious Allied nations, the United States, the Soviet Union, France, and Great Britain. However, as I completed my tour of Nuremberg, I became somewhat leery. Among many facts surrounding the trial, including the fact that Stalin's Soviet Union was on the prosecuting panel, leadership that 13 years prior had killed 4 million of its own citizens through what is now known as the Holodomor, the Nuremberg trials were heralded as an accomplice to the objectives of the United Nations organization, and a cornerstone for the ICC, the International Criminal Court. Now, not understanding initially that the United Nations organization was in any way connected to the Nuremberg trials, I took a step back, and I knew that I needed to dig a little deeper before painting the picture of Nuremberg that I originally had in mind. So I popped the hood of the Nuremberg narrative, bypassing surface-level information and looking almost exclusively at documentation, transcripts, and periodical reporting from the time of the trials in 1945 and 1946. Here is what I uncovered. The Nuremberg trials took place under the directive of the United States after World War II. The dust was settling, and facts surrounding the atrocities of Hitler's regime could no longer be ignored. Widespread public opinion was that the Nazi war criminals should be punished, and the United States spearheaded the efforts at Nuremberg, being joined by Allied powers of the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and France. United States Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson was spokesperson for the trial and chief United States prosecutor. Jackson was a major advocate for President FDR's liberal New Deal programs in the 1930s, and according to an article by Antitrust, quote, Jackson never attended college and spent only 1 year at Albany Law School, making him the last Supreme Court justice to be appointed without having graduated from law school. Now, despite all of this, President Truman gave Justice Jackson, quote, unparalleled freedom to construct a model for the Nuremberg Trials. Under the directive of Robert Jackson, the International Military Tribunal was formed. The tribunal consisted of 4 prosecutors, 1 from each of the 4 Allied nations. And according to Stanford.edu, this was, quote, monumental. The first time international law was used to prosecute individuals for war crimes. The Nuremberg Trials opened in November of 1945, 6 months after the close of World War II. Justice Jackson's opening speech for the Nuremberg Trials resounded with one primary objective for the proceedings: the prevention of aggressive warfare into the future. Now, a war-torn world was in favor of this objective, with 75% of the American population agreeing that these Nazi leaders ought to be prosecuted. But Jackson began to garner criticism, not for the end goal of the trials, but for the means that he employed to reach them. What needs to be understood here is that the Nuremberg trials took place in direct correlation with the formation of the United Nations organization. In fact, the United Nations Charter was officially ratified just 26 days before the opening of the Nuremberg trials. And as a definition here, a charter being a formal document describing the rights, aims, or principles of an organization or group of people. And charters attain legitimacy by 2 primary means: ratification and implementation. Ratification was achieved, as I said, 26 days before the opening of the Nuremberg trials at the San Francisco Conference. Implementation was achieved at Nuremberg. At the opening address of the Nuremberg trials, Robert Jackson himself quotes, "This trial is part of the great effort to make peace more secure. One step in this direction is the United Nations organization. This trial constitutes another step." But Jackson was taking unprecedented liberties in how he frameworked the prosecution process at Nuremberg. Those with an understanding of established law began to spit out their tea and cry foul on 2 viable counts. The first being the fact that instead of prosecuting based on existing international law, which did exist before the formation of the United Nations, Jackson formed the International Military Tribunal and developed 4 new types of crimes or counts by which the Nazi leaders were indicted: crimes against peace, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the crime of planning aggressive war. These counts directly reinforcing the objectives of the newly formed United Nations organization. A Saturday Evening Post article from 1946 argued the plain truth is that the prosecution might just as well have relied on existing international law. An article from the Commonwealth, 1946, the 20 men in the dock were legally responsible for crimes punishable by death under the laws of pre-Nazi Germany, indeed, under the laws of any civilized nation on earth. In Jackson's own words at the opening address of the Nuremberg trials, he cited that World War II allies wanted summary execution, but the United States pushed for the Nuremberg trials. A New Republic article from 1945 argued more is involved in the trial than just the punishment of the accused. A new departure will be made in international law, and if carried through, it will have far-reaching consequences. The second category of widespread objection to the proceedings at Nuremberg was that the IMT was employing ex post facto justice, something that is prohibited in virtually every law code in the world. And to explain the term, ex post facto justice or retroactive justice is the prosecution for individuals for crimes that were not crimes at the time they committed them. It was indisputable that atrocious crimes had taken place under Hitler's regime. But rather than being tried on the basis of mass murder, for example, these Nazi leaders were tried on the basis of the International Military Tribunal's new counts of crimes against peace, crimes against humanity, etc. These crimes, first, did not exist prior to the organization of the Nuremberg Trials, and second, they were not necessary in light of previously established law to bring these Nazi leaders to justice. The Commonwealth, September 1945, cites if international law is to develop moral weight and binding force, the enemy war criminals must be tried for crimes that were crimes at the time they were committed. In a Time article from 1946, weighty criticism from Robert Taft, son of President William Howard Taft and a highly respected leader in the U.S. Republican Party of the time, cites, "The trials violate the fundamental principles of American law, that a man cannot be tried under ex post facto statutes. The hanging of 11 men convicted at Nuremberg will be a blot on the American record that we shall long regret." Criticism of the Nuremberg trials was by no means absent or unfounded, but those who did criticize the trials risked ostracism. The purported end, which was justice for Nazi war criminals and the prevention of aggressive warfare, held so much public favor that those who would criticize exploitation of the means ran the risk of being labeled enemies of the peace or Nazi sympathizers. The Nuremberg trials were a success by the standards of those who advocated for them. 161 of the 199 Nazi officials were found guilty by the International Military Tribunal under the 4 newly established counts. 31 were sentenced to death by hanging, which took place in the gymnasium at Nuremberg just 14 days after the close of the first round of trials. A second round of trials at Nuremberg soon followed, accounting for another 24 death sentences. As I completed my research and outline of the events at Nuremberg, I realized that the Nuremberg campaign, if you would choose to call it such, can be broken into 5 parts, which repeated themselves during the pandemic of 2020. Number 1, there was an international crisis, which left a global population fearful and eager for solutions. Number 2, there was a palatable slogan that promised a solution. There were existing means to produce said solution. Those existing means were replaced by politically driven solutions. And number 5, whistleblowers were ostracized as enemies of the common good. So here is where I repeat my question. Does the end justify the means? Does the fact that Nazi leaders were finally executed justify replacing a well-founded legal system for a global judicial experiment? For me personally, this research project has encouraged me to be exceptionally critical of the means. As far as how this strategy, if it is a deliberate one, might be employed next, many are predicting a global financial crisis, with the UN already citing a 2030 agenda. The lead slogan for that agenda being to end poverty in all forms everywhere. For more on the potential of a new financial world order and how you might push back while there's still time, click here for my interview with Carol Roth, author of You Will Own Nothing and Be Happy.